Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get into the heart of today's story. A tale about a young student who marries a 71-year-old millionaire woman. But after just 7 days, he is shocked by what he discovers. This story is just beginning, and we'll be back soon with more. Comment yes if you want to hear the next part. Mark sat in the large, opulent bedroom, staring at the ceiling as the sounds of the mansion echoed around him. The weight of the marriage contract he had just signed settled heavily on his chest. He had expected it to be a temporary arrangement, something to get him out of his family's financial troubles. But as he looked around the extravagant room, the reality of it all hit him. He was now married to a woman he barely knew, a woman who was older than his mother. The mansion, the riches, the status, none of it felt real to him. It felt like a life that belonged to someone else. Eleanor, his new wife, had not shown much emotion throughout their brief ceremony. She was calm, poised, but distant. A contract had been signed, and in her mind, that was all that mattered. She had her reasons, he had his. But now that they were both bound by those reasons, Mark was beginning to question what it all meant. The mansion was quiet, too quiet for Mark's liking. He had been used to the noise and chaos of living in cramped apartments, where every corner of the house was filled with life. Here, in the massive estate, he felt more alone than ever. A small knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. He stood up, his legs slightly unsteady as he walked to the door. It was Eleanor's assistant, a well-dressed woman with a stern expression. "Mr. Davis," she said, "your wife requests your presence downstairs. She's waiting in the study." Mark nodded, though he wasn't sure what to expect. He followed the assistant down the long hallway, past rooms that were furnished with the finest furniture money could buy. Every surface gleamed with luxury, every detail screamed wealth. But it all felt empty. He reached the study, where Eleanor was sitting behind a large mahogany desk, the walls lined with bookshelves. The room was dimly lit, a stark contrast to the bright, airy living spaces he had passed through. Eleanor looked up as he entered, her eyes piercing and calculating. "Mark," she said, her voice calm as ever, "I wanted to speak with you about our arrangement." She motioned for him to sit in the chair across from her, and Mark obeyed, unsure of where this conversation was going. "I understand that this situation may be overwhelming for you," she continued. "But you need to know that there are certain expectations that come with being married to me." Mark sat back, feeling a chill run through him. He had expected Eleanor to discuss their financial arrangement or the logistics of their life together, but this felt different. "Expectations?" he asked, his voice steady despite the unease bubbling up inside him. Eleanor's gaze didn't waver as she nodded. "Yes, I'm a businesswoman, Mark. I built my empire on discipline, control, and efficiency. Our marriage is not just for show. It's a partnership, and that means we both have responsibilities to uphold." Mark felt a knot form in his stomach. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about power, control. Eleanor wasn't offering him a way out of his financial struggles. She was drawing him into her world, a world where her rules were the only ones that mattered. "What kind of responsibilities are you talking about?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm. Eleanor smiled slightly, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You will accompany me to business meetings, charity events, and social gatherings. You will be expected to maintain the appearance of a devoted husband. You will support me in my work, and you will keep up appearances. We will be a team, Mark. And that means no secrets." Mark was quiet for a moment, processing her words. He had signed up for a marriage of convenience. But this was more than he had bargained for. It wasn't just about sharing a name. It was about sharing a life that he hadn't prepared for. He had no idea what he was getting into, and he was starting to realize that he might not be ready for this world of wealth and influence. "And if I don't want to do this?" he asked, his voice tinged with frustration. Eleanor's eyes hardened. "You have no choice, Mark. You signed the contract." She leaned forward, her tone suddenly sharper. "You're in this now, and you will play your part." The silence between them stretched on for a long moment. Mark felt like a pawn in a game he didn't understand, forced to play by rules he couldn't see. But Eleanor wasn't finished. I've given you everything you need, she continued. You wanted a way out of your debts. You wanted security for your family. You wanted a future. Now, it's time for you to prove that you deserve it. Mark stared at her, the weight of her words settling on him. He had accepted her offer, but now he was realizing that the price of that offer might be more than he could handle. He wasn't just married to a stranger. He was married to a woman who controlled everything, and he was trapped in her world. I'll do what I have to, he said finally, his voice low. Eleanor's expression softened, but only for a moment. Good, she said, standing up. I knew you would. Welcome to my world, Mark. She turned to leave the study, leaving Mark alone with his thoughts. As he stared at the empty room, he couldn't help but wonder, what had he really signed up for? And was he ready to pay the price for it? Mark stood in front of the massive mirror in his new suit, adjusting the collar as he stared at his reflection. The weight of the tuxedo felt heavy on his shoulders, a constant reminder of how much his life had changed in such a short amount of time. He was now married to Eleanor Brooks, a woman he barely knew, and he was expected to play the role of the devoted husband in a life he had never imagined. A life filled with power, wealth, and expectations. As he buttoned the jacket, he couldn't help but feel like an actor, performing in a play that wasn't of his making. The door opened behind him, and Eleanor stepped in. She was dressed elegantly, as always, her presence filling the room with an air of authority. You look perfect, she said, her voice smooth and approving. Mark turned around, trying to hide the uncertainty that lingered in his eyes. You really think so? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor gave him a small smile. Of course. You're my husband now. You're supposed to look perfect. She moved closer, adjusting his tie with practiced ease, her fingers brushing his chest for a brief moment. It was a small, fleeting touch, but it sent a jolt of something unfamiliar through him. He had never been close to Eleanor in any personal way. They had barely exchanged more than a few words since their wedding. Their relationship had been strictly business, until now. Tonight is important, Eleanor continued, her gaze fixed on him as she stepped back to admire the effect. There are people who need to see us as a united front. You will need to stand by my side at the gala. You will need to play the part. Mark nodded, swallowing hard. He knew this night was coming, but now that it was here, he wasn't sure he was ready for it. Do you ever regret this? He asked, his voice quiet. Eleanor paused, looking at him for a moment as if considering the question. Then, with a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head, she replied, No, I don't regret it. This arrangement works for me, and I believe it will work for you too. Mark's stomach churned. He had entered this marriage to escape his debts and save his family, but he never imagined it would be this suffocating. He wasn't just playing the role of a husband. He was a pawn in Eleanor's world, a world where she controlled everything. The thought made his chest tighten, but he couldn't escape it. He had made his choice. He had signed the contract. The gala was held in the grand ballroom of Eleanor's estate, and as Mark stepped into the room, he felt the weight of all eyes on him. The guests were the city's elite, business tycoons, politicians, celebrities, all gathered to celebrate Eleanor's latest charity event. Mark stood by her side, looking every bit the part of a wealthy businessman, though inside, he felt like an imposter. As the night wore on, Eleanor moved through the crowd with ease, greeting people with a practiced smile, her charisma commanding attention. Mark, on the other hand, stood silently by her side, only occasionally joining in conversations when he was introduced. His mind wandered, thinking about his family, his mother's illness, and how he had ended up in this world. Eleanor was a woman of strength, of power, and Mark couldn't help but admire her in a way he hadn't expected. But there was something missing, something that made him feel even more isolated in the middle of all the luxury and wealth. As the evening drew to a close, Eleanor led him to the center of the room, where a grand piano stood beneath a crystal chandelier. The music swirled around them as she placed her hand on his arm, guiding him to the piano. Mark, she said softly, her voice laced with a hint of something deeper. This is our life now, together, and you will learn to accept it. Mark felt a shiver run down his spine as he looked into her eyes. She was right. This was his life now. There was no turning back. He was trapped in a world he didn't understand, with a woman who held all the cards. But as he looked around the room at the guests, at the people who admired Eleanor and the life she had built, Mark realized something. He wasn't just part of her world. He was now part of her legacy. And that was something he could never escape. I'll accept it, Mark said finally, his voice steady. But I'm not sure I'll ever belong here. Eleanor smiled, a hint of approval in her eyes. In time you will. In time, you'll realize that this is where you were always meant to be. Mark didn't know if he believed her, but he knew one thing for sure. His life had changed forever, and there was no going back. The weeks passed by in a blur for Mark. The initial shock of his new life with Eleanor had worn off, but a sense of unease still lingered in the back of his mind. The mansion, the events, the wealth, it all felt surreal, like he was living someone else's life. He had become an expert at playing the role of the devoted husband, attending galas and charity events by Eleanor's side, greeting important guests, and smiling for the cameras. But despite all the appearances of a perfect life, Mark was still struggling to find his place in Eleanor's world. Eleanor, on the other hand, was a vision of control and grace. She seemed at ease in the spotlight, always the picture of elegance and power. But there were moments, rare moments, when Mark would catch a glimpse of something deeper behind her polished exterior. A flicker of vulnerability, a moment of hesitation, but it was always gone before he could question it. It was as if Eleanor had built up walls around herself, and Mark was only allowed to see what she wanted him to see. One evening, after a particularly lavish charity gala, Eleanor invited Mark to join her for dinner in her private study. It was one of the few times they had shared a meal alone in the mansion, away from the public eye. The two of them sat at the large oak table, the room dimly lit by a single chandelier. The only sound was the soft clink of their silverware as they ate in silence. Mark couldn't help but feel the weight of the silence between them. It had been a while since they had had a real conversation, and he was beginning to wonder if their marriage was truly just a business arrangement, as Eleanor had always insisted. "You've been quiet lately," Eleanor said, breaking the silence. Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that Mark couldn't ignore. He looked up, meeting her eyes. "I've been thinking," he said slowly, "about all of this. About what you want, what I want." Eleanor raised an eyebrow, setting her fork down. "And what do you want, Mark?" she asked, her tone softening slightly. Mark hesitated, unsure of how to answer. He had agreed to marry her for the financial security, to help his family, but now he was starting to realize that there was more to it than that. There was something about Eleanor, something that drew him in, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was just another pawn in her game. "I want to understand," he said quietly. "I want to understand what this marriage really means. What do you expect from me? What do you want from me, Eleanor?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. Then, she sighed and leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping gently on the edge of the table. "I never expected you to understand, Mark," she said softly. "This isn't about love or affection. It's about power, about building something that will last long after we're gone." Mark's heart sank as he listened to her words. She had always made it clear that their marriage wasn't about love, but hearing her say it out loud made the reality of it hit him harder than ever. "And what about me?" he asked quietly. "Where do I fit into all of this?" Eleanor's gaze softened, but only slightly. "You fit in because you signed the contract," she replied. "You're my partner in this, Mark. Not in the way that lovers are partners, but in a way that benefits us both. You help me maintain the image, and I give you the security you need." Mark stared at her, feeling a strange mix of disappointment and anger. He had known this was a business arrangement, but hearing her spell it out so plainly made him feel like he was nothing more than a tool to her. "I don't know if I can do this anymore," he said quietly, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Eleanor didn't react immediately. She just sat there, her fingers still tapping on the table, as if considering his words. Finally, she looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "What are you saying, Mark?" she asked, her voice colder now. "I'm saying that I'm starting to question everything," he replied, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I'm starting to wonder if this is all worth it. If I'm just a pawn in your game, if this marriage is really about us, or if it's all just about the image you're trying to create." Eleanor's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Mark thought she might say something harsh. But instead, she stood up slowly and walked over to the window, looking out at the city below. "You knew what this was when you signed the contract," she said, her back to him now. "I gave you what you wanted, and you've played your part well. But if you're starting to question your place here, then perhaps this marriage isn't for you. Mark's heart raced as he processed her words. He had no idea what to say next, but in that moment, he realized that he wasn't just trapped in Eleanor's world, he was also trapped by his own choices. He had agreed to this life, but now, he wasn't sure how much of it he could handle. Eleanor's words echoed in his mind as he sat there in silence, the weight of their marriage bearing down on him. This wasn't just a game. It was his life. And now, more than ever, he had to figure out what he truly wanted from it. The days following their tense conversation were filled with silence between Mark and Eleanor. He had never felt more alone in the mansion than he did now. Despite the wealth and luxury surrounding him, Mark felt trapped. The mansion, once an exciting symbol of security, now felt like a gilded cage. He had expected that marrying Eleanor would change his life, but the weight of the arrangement was becoming unbearable. Eleanor, on the other hand, seemed unaffected by the tension. She continued her usual routine, attending meetings and hosting events, all while maintaining the same distance from Mark. It was as though nothing had changed for her, and she was merely going through the motions of their marriage as if it were just another part of her business empire. Mark, however, couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. He had agreed to this marriage for financial stability, but now that he was living in this world of wealth, he realized how empty it all felt. Eleanor never looked at him with the warmth he had hoped for. There was no tenderness, no affection, just the cold practicality of a contract being fulfilled. One evening, Mark found himself sitting alone in the study, staring out at the city lights below. He had been avoiding Eleanor for the past few days, unsure of what to say or do. He wasn't sure if it was anger or fear that held him back, but the distance between them had only grown. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the door opening. Eleanor entered, dressed in a simple black dress, her expression as unreadable as ever. "Mark," she said softly, her voice carrying a hint of uncertainty. "We need to talk." Mark looked up at her, his heart racing. "About what?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Eleanor walked toward him, stopping just short of the desk. She paused, as if choosing her words carefully. "About us," she said, her tone shifting slightly. "I know things have been difficult between us, but I want to make sure you understand what this marriage means, what it's really about." Mark stood up from the chair, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "I understand what it's about, Eleanor. It's about you and your empire. It's about maintaining appearances, keeping up the facade of the perfect marriage," he said, his voice sharp. Eleanor's eyes narrowed, but she didn't argue. Instead, she walked over to the window, looking out at the city with a contemplative expression. "It's more than that, Mark," she said quietly. "This marriage is about building something that will last beyond us. It's about creating a legacy." Mark stared at her, disbelief washing over him. "A legacy?" he repeated. "You think this marriage is about a legacy?" Eleanor turned to face him, her eyes softening for the first time in a long while. "Yes," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I've built everything I have on my own. I have no children, no family left to pass anything on to. That's why I need you here. Not as a lover, not as a companion, but as a partner. You're the one who will carry on the work I've started." Mark's mind raced as he processed her words. He had always known that Eleanor's motivations were driven by something deeper than love, but hearing her say it out loud made the reality of their marriage hit him harder than ever. She wasn't asking for love, she was asking for a legacy, and he was supposed to be part of it. "And what if I don't want to be part of it?" Mark asked, his voice quiet but filled with emotion. Eleanor's gaze didn't waver. "Then we can part ways," she said, her voice cold. "But I don't think that's what you want." Mark stood there, staring at her, trying to figure out what he wanted. He had thought that accepting this marriage would give him the life he always dreamed of, but now he wasn't so sure. He had been so focused on the financial security it would bring him that he had never truly considered the cost. He wasn't just living a lie. He was living in a world where he had no control, no voice. Eleanor was the one in charge, and he was just along for the ride. "I don't know what I want anymore," Mark said, his voice barely a whisper. Eleanor stepped closer, her eyes locked on his. "You don't have to know right now," she said softly. "But you do need to understand that this marriage is more than just a piece of paper. It's about something bigger, something that will last. And if you're not willing to be a part of that, then we have nothing more to talk about." Mark's heart sank as he stared at her. The weight of her words hung in the air, suffocating him. He had thought he was making a choice for his family, for his future. But now he realized that he was being pulled into a world where he didn't belong, and he wasn't sure if he could ever escape it. Eleanor's words echoed in his mind as she turned to leave the room. He felt like he was drowning in a world of wealth and power, a world that promised everything and yet gave him nothing. As Eleanor disappeared from the study, Mark was left alone with his thoughts. The future seemed uncertain, and for the first time, he wasn't sure if he could continue living in the life he had chosen. Mark sat in the study long after Eleanor left, the weight of her words pressing on him. He felt trapped in a life that wasn't his, bound by a contract, and by a future that was being forced upon him. He had married Eleanor for the financial stability, for his family, but as each day passed, he found himself losing a little bit more of who he was. The life of luxury was beginning to feel like a prison, a gilded cage where every move was controlled, every decision made for him. He had no freedom, no voice. And Eleanor, for all her wealth and power, seemed just as distant as ever. He couldn't deny the attraction he felt for her, the connection that was undeniable when their eyes met. But that was all it ever was, a fleeting moment. She was too focused on her empire, on the legacy she was building, to ever truly see him. He was just another piece of her grand plan. The next day, Eleanor was hosting another charity event, and Mark had no choice but to attend, playing his part as the supportive husband. He had become a master at pretending, smiling when he needed to, speaking when he had to, and staying in the background as she took the spotlight. But as the evening wore on, Mark felt the familiar emptiness creeping in. He had no idea who these people were, no real connections to any of them. He was just a pawn, a trophy by Eleanor's side. As they mingled, he found himself alone for a moment, standing by the large windows that overlooked the city below. The lights were dazzling, but to him, it felt like he was staring into a void. He had everything he could have ever wanted in terms of wealth and status, but none of it meant anything. None of it filled the emptiness he felt inside. As he stood there, lost in his thoughts, Eleanor appeared beside him, her presence as commanding as always. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there beside him, staring out at the city. Mark turned to her, his frustration boiling over. "Do you ever stop?" he asked, his voice sharp. Eleanor raised an eyebrow, glancing at him but saying nothing. "You're always so focused on your work, your image, your empire," he continued, the words slipping out before he could stop them. "What about us? What about this marriage? Do you even care?" Eleanor's expression softened slightly, but only for a moment. She sighed and turned to face him fully. "Mark," she said quietly, "I've built everything I have from the ground up. Every decision I've made, every sacrifice, it's all been to ensure that I leave something behind. A legacy that will last." Mark stared at her, his heart sinking as he listened to her words. She didn't see him. She didn't see what he needed, what he wanted. He wasn't just a tool for her success. He was a person, with his own dreams and desires. "I'm not part of your legacy," he said quietly, his voice shaking. "I'm just a pawn in your game." Eleanor's eyes flickered, and for the briefest moment, Mark thought he saw a hint of regret, but it was gone as quickly as it came. "You agreed to this, Mark," she said, her tone firm again. "You signed the contract. You knew what this was from the beginning." Mark nodded, his chest tight with emotion. He had known what he was getting into, but he hadn't known how much it would hurt, how much he would lose in the process. He had given up his freedom, his independence, for the promise of security. But now he was starting to realize that security didn't mean happiness. It didn't mean love. Eleanor seemed to sense the change in him, the shift in his mood. "Mark," she said, her voice softer this time, "you don't understand what it takes to build something like this. I need someone by my side who can handle the pressure, who can be part of the future I'm creating. This marriage isn't just about us. It's about everything I've worked for." Mark's heart felt heavy as he listened to her, but something inside him snapped. "What if I don't want to be part of it?" he asked, his voice trembling with emotion. "What if I don't want to be a part of your legacy? What if I just want to find my own path, my own purpose?" Eleanor's face hardened, her eyes narrowing slightly. "That's not an option, Mark," she said, her voice cold. "You made your choice when you signed the contract. There's no turning back." Mark's heart raced, the weight of her words settling over him like a dark cloud. He had been caught in her web, and now there was no escape. The promise of a new life, of financial security, had seemed like a dream, but now it felt like a nightmare. Eleanor wasn't the woman he had hoped she would be. She wasn't the partner he had dreamed of. She was a force of nature, consumed by her own vision, and he was just along for the ride. "I don't know how much longer I can do this," Mark said, his voice barely a whisper. Eleanor didn't respond. She simply turned and walked away, leaving Mark standing alone in the crowd of people. The music played softly in the background. The chatter of the guests filled the air, but Mark felt more alone than ever. He had everything he could ever want in terms of material wealth, but he had lost something far more important, his sense of self. And now, more than ever, he wasn't sure if he could keep pretending. As the night wore on, Mark found himself standing by the window again, looking out at the city. The lights were beautiful, but they couldn't light the darkness that had settled in his heart. He had made his choice, but now, he wasn't sure it was the right one. Mark couldn't shake the feeling of being lost in a life that wasn't his. The grand ballroom of Eleanor's estate had once felt like a dream, but now it felt like a cage. He stood there, watching her move through the crowd, effortlessly commanding attention from everyone around her. She was a woman of power, of wealth, but Mark realized more and more that she was not the woman he had imagined. She had become a symbol of everything he didn't want, and yet he couldn't escape the life she had drawn him into. The pressure of it all was beginning to wear him down. Every day, he played the role of the perfect husband, the perfect partner, but inside, he was breaking. He had given up so much of himself to be with Eleanor, but what had he really gained? The nights spent alone in their vast mansion, the endless charity events, the constant smile he wore, it was all a facade. The distance between them had only grown, and Mark found himself questioning everything. One evening, after another cold, silent dinner with Eleanor, Mark could feel his frustration boiling over. He had tried to bury it, to push it aside, but tonight it was different. He was done pretending. He stood up from the dinner table, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Eleanor looked up at him, an unreadable expression on her face. "Mark," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Where are you going?" "I need some air," he replied, his voice tight with emotion. Without waiting for a response, he walked out of the dining room and into the garden, the cool night air hitting his face like a slap. The sound of his footsteps echoed through the empty garden as he walked along the path, the full moon casting shadows on the manicured lawns. For the first time in months, he felt free, away from the oppressive walls of the mansion and the suffocating expectations that came with being Eleanor's husband. But even in the quiet of the garden, he couldn't escape the reality of his situation. He had nowhere to go. He had no real future outside of this life. He had made his choices, but now, he wasn't sure they were the right ones. Eleanor had built her empire, and Mark had been brought into it as a pawn. He had agreed to be her partner, but all he had done was lose himself in the process. He leaned against the stone wall of the garden, staring up at the sky, trying to clear his mind. But the thoughts wouldn't stop. Was this really his life now? Was he destined to live in the shadow of Eleanor's success, to be nothing more than a part of her carefully curated image? He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath, trying to steady his racing thoughts. "You're not happy." A voice interrupted his thoughts. Mark turned around to see Eleanor standing behind him, her presence as commanding as always. She had followed him outside, though he hadn't heard her approach. "Eleanor," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore." Eleanor stepped closer, her gaze softening for the first time in a long while. "I know," she said quietly. "I can see it. You're not the man you were when we first met." Mark didn't respond, his mind racing. He wanted to tell her how he felt, to admit how suffocating everything had become, but the words wouldn't come. He was afraid of what she might say, afraid of how she might react. "I never wanted this to happen," Eleanor continued, her voice tinged with regret. "I never wanted to push you into something you weren't ready for. But I have built this life, this empire, and I need someone by my side who can understand it, who can share it with me." Mark looked at her, searching her eyes for any sign of vulnerability, but all he saw was the same cold determination. "I don't know if I can be that person," he said quietly, his voice filled with uncertainty. "I don't know if I can be the man you need me to be." Eleanor's expression hardened again, the walls she had built around herself returning. "You knew what this marriage was when you signed the contract," she said, her tone firm. "This was never about love. It was about partnership. And if you can't handle that, then maybe we've reached the end. Mark felt his heart drop. This was it. He had reached the breaking point. He had been holding on to the hope that things could change, that somehow he could find a way to fit into her world. But now, he realized that he was just a piece in her grand plan, nothing more. I can't do this anymore, Mark said, his voice trembling with emotion. Eleanor didn't respond right away. She simply turned and walked away, leaving Mark standing in the garden, the weight of his decision pressing on him like never before. He had reached a crossroads, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't know what to do. The path ahead seemed uncertain, but Mark knew one thing for sure. He couldn't keep living a life that wasn't his. He had to find a way out, no matter what it cost. Mark sat in the quiet of his room, the soft hum of the mansion surrounding him as he tried to gather his thoughts. Eleanor's words echoed in his mind, heavy and unyielding. Maybe we've reached the end. The thought made his chest tighten, but deep down, he knew she was right. He had been holding on to a version of this life that no longer fit him. The reality of their marriage, the contract they had signed, was too far removed from what he had once hoped for. He had hoped for freedom, for a way out of his debts, but now it felt like he had lost everything in the process. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the door opening. Eleanor stepped inside, her presence commanding the room. She didn't speak at first, just stood there, her gaze fixed on him. Mark could feel the weight of the silence between them, a silence that felt different than before. It wasn't just the tension of unspoken words. It was the weight of everything that had been left unsaid for so long. Mark, Eleanor said softly, her voice almost gentle, I've been thinking. Mark looked up at her, a sense of wariness settling over him. About what? He asked, his voice thick with uncertainty. Eleanor took a step closer, her eyes softening, the sharpness that usually defined her gaze absent. About us, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't realize how much I was asking of you. How much this has cost you. Mark swallowed hard, the lump in his throat growing. He wanted to believe her, wanted to believe that she understood what he had been going through, but the reality of their situation was too complicated to make simple sense of. You're not the man you were when we first met, she continued, her voice carrying a sadness he had never heard before. You've lost something, and I've done nothing to help you find it. The words hit him like a punch, and for a moment, Mark couldn't respond. He had given so much of himself to this marriage, to this life, but in doing so, he had lost pieces of himself that he wasn't sure how to get back. Eleanor stood there, her posture now less rigid, almost vulnerable. I built this empire on my own, Mark, she said quietly. I never thought about what it would cost. What it would cost you. Mark felt his heart ache at the vulnerability in her voice. He had always seen her as a woman who was in control of everything, someone who never let anything or anyone get too close. But now, in this moment, she seemed as lost as he felt. And what about me? Mark asked, his voice strained. What about my dreams, my future? Where do I fit into all of this? Eleanor didn't answer immediately. She walked to the window, looking out at the city below, her hands resting on the windowsill. For a moment, it seemed like she was deep in thought, weighing her next words carefully. I never wanted you to lose yourself in this, she said finally. But I didn't know how to make you see that I needed you, Mark. I didn't know how to make you see that I wanted more than just a business partner. I wanted a real partnership. The sincerity in her voice made Mark's chest tighten. For the first time, he felt like she wasn't just talking about the marriage. She was talking about them as people. And for the first time, he started to wonder if there was more to this relationship than just a contract. And what now? Mark asked, his voice a whisper. What happens now, Eleanor? Eleanor turned to face him, her eyes locking with his. We figure it out, she said softly. Together. I don't know if we can go back to where we started, but maybe we can start again, from here. Mark stood up slowly, the weight of the moment pressing on him. He didn't know if this was the beginning of something new or if it was the end of the road for them. But in that moment, he realized something. He had been so focused on what he had lost that he had forgotten to look at what he still had. Maybe there was still a chance for them, but it wouldn't come from pretending. It would come from honesty, from facing the truth about who they were and what they wanted. Eleanor stepped closer, her hand reaching out, and Mark took it, his heart pounding. For the first time in a long while, he felt something other than emptiness. He felt hope. Maybe this was the beginning of something different. Maybe, Together, they could find a way to make it work. "Let's try," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Let's try, Eleanor." And for the first time since they had married, he felt like they might actually have a chance. Mark and Eleanor sat across from each other in the quiet of their study, the weight of their conversation still lingering in the air. The last few days had been filled with difficult, honest talks, and although neither of them had all the answers, there was a shift between them. They had agreed to try to figure things out together. For the first time, Mark didn't feel like he was just fulfilling an obligation. There was a glimmer of something more, something real. "I never thought we'd be here," Eleanor said softly, her eyes searching his face. "Neither did I," Mark replied, a small smile tugging at his lips. "But here we are." She leaned back in her chair, her gaze softening. "I know I've asked a lot of you. I don't want to lose you, Mark. Not because of what we've built, but because of what we could still build together." Her words struck something deep within him. Eleanor had always been so focused on her empire, her legacy, but now, she was speaking of them, of their future. It wasn't just about business anymore. It was about partnership, about love. Mark reached across the table, taking her hand in his. He had been so afraid of losing himself in her world that he forgot to look at what he still had. "We've both made mistakes," Mark said quietly. "But maybe that's just part of it. We're not perfect, but we have each other." Eleanor smiled, squeezing his hand. "Maybe we don't need to be perfect," she said. "Maybe we just need to be real." Mark nodded, feeling the weight of the past few months lift off his shoulders. They had a long road ahead of them, but for the first time, he felt like it wasn't just a road he had to walk alone. Eleanor stood up, walking over to the window and looking out at the city below. Mark joined her, standing by her side, the two of them gazing at the lights of the city. "You know," Eleanor said after a long pause, "I used to think that building something this big meant I had to do it alone. But now, I'm not so sure." Mark looked at her, his heart swelling with emotion. "You don't have to do it alone," he said. "Not anymore." She turned to him, a look of vulnerability in her eyes that he had never seen before. "And you don't have to be just a part of my legacy, Mark," Eleanor said, her voice soft but firm. "You have your own path, your own future, and I want to be a part of that, too." The words hit Mark harder than he expected. He had spent so much time feeling like he was just following her lead, just a part of her world, but now he realized that he could have his own, and that Eleanor wanted to be a part of it. He smiled, feeling a sense of peace wash over him. "We'll figure it out together," he said. "One step at a time." Eleanor nodded, her eyes lighting up with something he hadn't seen in a long time: hope. The tension that had built up between them was finally starting to fade, replaced by a new understanding, a new beginning. They didn't know what the future would hold, but for the first time, they were ready to face it side by side. "Maybe we can start fresh," Eleanor said, her voice filled with optimism. Mark nodded, squeezing her hand. "Together," he replied. And as they stood there, looking out at the city, they both knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but it would be worth it. Because now, they weren't just building a legacy. They were building a life. Together.